A huge volley of shots just as I left the front line caused panic. The young man in front of me fell dead. 2 others were killed yards away.
June the 3rd, 1989. I was in the Chinese capital, Beijing, reporting on the long-running crisis in Tiananmen Square.
The troops have been firing indiscriminately, but still, there are thousands of people on the streets who will not move back.
I could see soldiers on the lorries firing.
The bicycle rickshaws scooped up the injured.
The world watched in horror as the Chinese army fired on demonstrators, demanding greater political freedom from the country's communist leadership. The images of ordinary people standing up for rights we take for granted live in the memories of anyone who watched them. It's been said that journalism is the first draft of history, so 30 years later, I'm reviewing events as I reported them. I turned round and the man on my right wasn't there. He was on the ground, dead.
There was gunfire from those lorries.
To set my reports in the wider context, I'm going to meet a historian.
What they saw in the square was an existential challenge to the Communist Party's monopoly of power.
A line of soldiers was strung out, facing a huge crowd.
For them, it was a life and death struggle.
And BBC archives show how documentary filmmakers have seen the story over time. China's now an ever-growing presence, and the events in Tiananmen Square a pivotal moment. I think they should not be forgotten. It's the only story I've ever felt it was important to say, yes, I was there, because we got a slice of history. When I filed those reports from Tiananmen Square, I'd already been a BBC producer and reporter for almost 20 years.
An enormous list of people.
I joined the national TV news team in 1976
A railway station.
and covered all kinds of stories wherever they happened. Stories like the Fastnet race disaster.
Some of those rescued talked about being hit at sea by a great fury.
I covered everything from politics, industry, football, social affairs at home. Even the announcement of Prince Charles and Diana's engagement, encountering the proud father of the bride.
Can I say congratulations?
Thank you very much.
Earl Spencer himself.
Very proud and very happy.
Get down.
Along with strikes, protests, the troubles in Northern Ireland, the storming of the Iranian embassy in London by the SAS.
At least half a dozen bombs.
In the 80s, terrorism and bomb explosions were on a reporter's daily menu.
4 hours after the raid, the Libyans still have no idea how many people were injured here.
I had been in extraordinary situations for a good decade and a half. Revolution, often protest, demonstration. I was a journalist, but I wasn't a specialist.
The operating theatre was overflowing.
To tell the story of Tiananmen Square, there are not just my reports.
All with gunshots.
There are the BBC archives, showing how filmmakers saw China before the massacre, and in the years that followed, as the Chinese Communist Party tried to rewrite history. Tiananmen Square was shocking and has an enduring effect. For me, one that lingers, in that I'm currently banned from entering China. Today, censorship and internal repression make it difficult to gauge what's really going on there. But one of the world's most respected China watchers can assess why the Chinese government behaved as they did at Tiananmen Square, and what's happened in China since. Professor Steve Sang is based at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, beset by a small demo on the day I arrive.
18 months ago, I was planning a visit, and my visa was refused. It seems extraordinary so many years later.
The Communist Party has very long memories, and they start to see foreign journalists who criticize China in sensitive areas as being, in a sense, anti-China. And I think that's probably why you were given this badge of honor.
Is it right to say that this pivotal event in China's recent history is today virtually unknown inside the country itself?
The state has made enormous efforts to erase the history.
I think you're absolutely right. That memory is being actively erased. The younger generations would not know anything about it. They didn't even know Tiananmen ever happened. A lot of the people who lived through it, they would also mostly try to put it behind them and move on.
1989 was an exceptional year for a reporter like me. There was political unrest in many parts of the world, not just in China. All over Eastern Europe, demands for greater freedom and economic reform would culminate in the toppling of the Berlin Wall. The decades-long Cold War, the tense standoff between communist Russia and China and the Western allies, seemed to be coming to an end. As 1989 dawned, my diary has brief references to communist regimes in trouble. No pattern to the year, no idea what it's going to hold, and I started off here. In Afghanistan, we took a mobile satellite dish in a very, very rickety truck up the Khyber Pass.
The Mujahideen are gathered in groups around buildings previously held by Soviet and Afghan regular troops.
In less than an hour, we've had 2 air raids and a rocket attack.
Motley groups of fighters had forced Russia into a humiliating withdrawal. Communist regimes in power since World War II were being challenged. Cracks were appearing. Then, in April 1989, news emerged of unprecedented protest in China. For 40 years, communism had held sway virtually unchallenged over China's 1 billion people. Yet now there were vast demonstrations in the streets.
People were getting bolder and bolder. There was a sense that things are changing, and perhaps even more would change. That's where we were before Tiananmen Square.
The government was inscrutable as to reaction. But in the early summer, party leaders and protesters seemed on a collision course. Towards the end of May, I was asked to back up my colleagues already in China. I was no specialist, but knew the difficulties of reporting an enigma. The Chinese were very, very secretive about the sort of thing which we would take for granted. When you went there, you got followed. They were unused to the idea of journalists poking their noses into things, taking pictures. So China was difficult to cover. In the past few years, there had been some softening of its authoritarian image. The BBC archive shows TV documentary makers had occasionally been allowed in to witness improvements inside the country. In 1986, Newsnight had sent John Tusa to compile a special report on the Communist Party's attempts to reform the Chinese economy.
The Chinese people are in the middle of their third revolution of the 20th century. In 1911, the nationalists under Sun Yat-sen overthrew the Manchu dynasty and the Empress Dowager. In 1949, the communists under Mao Zedong overthrew the nationalist government. Today, communist centralization and strict party control are being replaced by something quite different. The architect is the 80-year-old Deng Xiaoping, China's effective leader. 7 years ago, he introduced reforms which have started to transform China's economy, have opened the door to the outside world, and are opening the minds of the Chinese people. New opportunities are pushing aside old bitterness. It's no crime now to get rich. The new party line encourages you to chance your arm in the marketplace. The consumer's voice is to be heard. The diligent and hard-working will get paid more. The lazy will earn less and be punished. The atmosphere in the country is changing.
Were the Chinese going to get a taste of increased affluence? Were they going to change? Was the party going to change? Or would it just disappear as communism was beginning to ebb in the rest of the Western world? We didn't know.
This new transparency worked both ways. People in China could now experience the wider world via their TV screens.
The remote grassland plateau of Inner Mongolia. Nowadays, after a hard day in the saddle, these descendants of the warrior clans of Genghis Khan come home for tea with the family in front of the television. The world's most populous nation is getting its first glimpse of the planet through the flickering trickery of television and by the light of the luminous screen. 300 million Chinese watch the main evening news direct from the capital, Peking, now Beijing, at 7 o'clock. Tonight, the lead story is the visit to London of the Chief Secretary of the Communist Party. For centuries, China has been kept in the totalitarian dark about itself and the world outside. Now the shutters are being flung open. Will Chinese television be the world's biggest exercise in mind control? Can you control a billion minds, daily better informed, daily more critical?
Looking back now, in a country which still had many of the trappings of a dictatorship, it's surprising that ordinary people felt free to talk politics in the open.
Do you think you get an accurate picture of the world from the news, or do you think you get propaganda?
Yeah, some part propaganda, not total.
Because all China is reformed, so we television program all still will be reformed, I think.
You think the television programs will be reformed?
Yes, reformed better and better.
And soon.
And soon, I think.
Many Chinese viewers tuned into TV beamed from Hong Kong, then still ruled by the British.
In the 80s, what happens would be that for the cities and the coastal regions, they would actually be watching Hong Kong television. So you have increasing number of Chinese citizens who have a sense of what television in a non-party controlled environment would be like, and they loved it.
We were getting a bigger picture of China, but I don't think anybody quite knew where it was heading. The Communist Party is probably one of the most secretive organizations in the world when it comes to government.
Even BBC One's holiday program headed east, airing its first item on Chinese tourism in January 1989. Groundbreaking stuff from the upbeat presenters in exotic locations.
Welcome to China.
Guilin has a history going back 2,000 years. You feel you've gone back most of them in comparison to Hong Kong. Here, the skyscrapers are not man-made, and activity on the Lijiang River is hardly frantic.
They say this is the most beautiful part of China.
There seems to be a perpetual slight mist about the place, making it rather eerie. Your taste buds quickly bring you back to reality, though. I shall long remember the superb cooking and the steady pace of life.
All that just weeks away from other TV reporters like me heading for Tiananmen Square. There'd also been a Newsnight report, which is chilling in retrospect.
China's armed forces are being shaken up by the new values now prevailing. The 4,000 elite officer cadets at China's newest military academy at Shijiazhuang are pointing the way to an entirely new kind of army. They represent a rejection of the ideals of the old People's Liberation Army in everything but name. The spit and polish, the intense discipline, the professional pride are the marks of a new elite. They're also values the Chinese leadership would like instilled into the people at large. Innovation, self-discipline, modernization.
Perhaps all this should have been viewed with more than a pinch of salt, considering what was to follow. But in April 1989, anything seemed possible, with the spark of protest in China becoming ablaze. Huge demonstrations were staged in the capital, then called Peking, and other large cities like Shanghai. The protesters were mainly students, complaining of corruption in the state bureaucracy, censorship of the press, and of economic and social reform proceeding much too slowly. By mid-May, several students had begun a hunger strike, and then a crisis for the party leaders. The Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, arriving in Peking for a long-planned summit meeting. A pivotal moment. Gorbachev, the champion of reform in the Soviet Union. Here in China, his arrival was a huge boost for the protesters. So how did the leadership react?
What really concerned them with the continuing presence of the students in the square?
When Gorbachev went to China, with an enormous presence of international media, the Chinese Communist Party leadership had to tell Gorbachev that when he walked through Tiananmen Square, he might have to deal with the demonstrations. That was the enormous loss of face for the Communist Party.
The world's media watched and speculated, many apparently convinced that seismic change was underway.
Events in China tonight are astonishing. And how will this extraordinary crisis unravel in the next hours or days? Few doubt that this irrepressible build-up of popular demand will lead to historic change in China. Gavin Esler examines the implications of this unprecedented challenge to China's leaders.
From the moment China's protesters intensified their demonstrations in Peking today, it became clear that the outcome of this extraordinary display of people power could well decide the future direction of the country. It's not that their hunger strikes or slogans will transform China into a Western-style democracy, but their protest has now definitely struck a chord among the mass of China's discontented. Intellectuals who want greater political freedoms, journalists who want a free press, and most dangerous of all for the communist leaders, ordinary workers from within the largest industrial proletariat on earth, 70 million people. History is now being made on the streets of Peking. As night fell, the demonstrations were undiminished. It's not certain whether reformers may be able to harness the raw energy of the streets. There could be a conservative backlash. Yet whichever faction wins through, this Peking spring seems certain to change the course of history for China's billion people.
As a mere bystander, it wasn't at all clear what the protests would achieve.
It was very difficult to see where the students were heading. There was known to be a harsh system of repression for those who went against the leadership. Like anyone else, I'd been watching the previous couple of months' coverage, assuming it would be covered by the Hong Kong correspondent and maybe one or two more. But then I got an emergency call from London which said, head for Beijing. The two correspondents have had to pull out. One had lost his voice, the other one had to go home for a personal reason. And so up I went to the capital, not ever having expected to be covering those demonstrations. Everybody was speculating, and had done for weeks, about what would these students achieve. I went straight out to walk through these crowds of young people. The atmosphere was not like a student demonstration with everybody standing and shouting, and serious groups Lots of bespectacled students sitting around debating. My early reports reflected a sense of growing anger from the government, but it still wasn't clear what was to come.
One target for the authorities' anger is the giant statue nicknamed Goddess of Democracy and Freedom, which has been installed by students in Tiananmen Square. From Peking, Kate Adie.
To differentiate her from the New York Statue of Liberty, she's been dubbed a goddess of democracy and freedom. She's cited symbolically, at her back the monument to people's heroes, and facing the Forbidden City, a challenge to 5,000 years of feudal, undemocratic rule. However, the authorities are much riled by her presence, and today's newspaper editorials are using ever harder language against the students. The statue's an insult to China, say the papers, a 30-foot thorn in the increasingly sensitive official flesh. Kate Adie, BBC News, Peking.
They didn't use the term revolution. They weren't talking about taking over, getting rid of the top people. That wasn't the case. It was a plea for a better society. They wanted more freedoms.
They thought perhaps this time the government will listen to us. Then you have the interest of the international media. And once the international media was there, the very smart students who were in the demonstrations start to realize that, well, why don't we ask for democracy?
That was exactly what the old-style leaders feared most. So they tried to organize counter-protests, which I covered, and which didn't ring true.
There have been growing calls for the student demonstrations in Peking to end. There have been officially organized rallies in favor of the government's harder line.
The farmers and rural workers had been ordered to assemble on the sports ground in Miyun. Not a hint of spontaneity graced the proceedings. On being asked where they were heading, they replied, "Don't know, we follow the party." The Children's Committee merely joins an ever-lengthening list of organizations now dutifully publishing round condemnations of the students. All the newspapers are now towing the official disapproving line, with intimations of trouble for what's called the tiny bunch who incite turmoil. Kate Adie, BBC News, Peking.
As events grew to a climax at the beginning of June, editors of the foreign media were asking their reporters, is the revolution underway? Is this it?
On the ground, we wouldn't say, we couldn't say. But then a new element stoked the fire.
There was a little change in the crowds. For the first time, there were more ordinary Beijing citizens coming into the square. The faithful, loyal worker who normally didn't question anything about the status quo. That's when real concern began to go through the top echelon. In came, on the night of June the 2nd, a huge number of military.
"10,000 Chinese troops have tried to seize control of the center of Peking tonight. Kate Adie has been watching developments in the square.
The soldiers were spotted 2 hours after midnight, walking down all the main roads to Tiananmen Square. Immediately, the whole area sprang to life, hundreds of people swarming towards them. Unarmed, many in shirt sleeves, the soldiers had been ordered to encircle Tiananmen and wait for armed police to clear the students away. Instead, they found themselves confronted by indignant, then angry people who blocked their way. Nearly an hour of uproar ensued, pushing and shoving, with some scuffles and fistfights. Eventually, the soldiers had to retreat. The whole army operation had collapsed into confusion.
This was clearly no mere exercise, but whatever the objective, it has gone very wrong for the authorities.
Kate Adie, BBC News, Peking.
Everyone went off to bed. There were rumors of troops and more troops, perhaps on the outskirts of the city, but nothing hard.
Early next morning, out on the streets again, there was increased tension.
Odd military vehicles sat abandoned and disabled. And weapons and military equipment left behind by the troops was exhibited on street corners, with captured guns on display. A move by the guards to prevent us taking pictures brought a furious response from the crowd. In the square, the mood was also electric. A suspected informer was given rough treatment. The government's action in trying to send in the troops and failing this time has precipitated an unprecedented and ever more complicated situation. Kate Adie, BBC News, Peking.
You thought, things are moving, but in which direction? Nobody envisaged what was going to happen in the next 24 hours.
Behind closed doors, was there any single thing which actually decided the crackdown?
What they saw in the square was an existential challenge to the Communist Party's monopoly of power. So for them, it was a life and death struggle.
Shortly before midnight on Saturday, June the 3rd, the army moved in from the city's outskirts. We got a call from one of the people who'd been helping us. He said, I can hear shooting. There is a lot of shooting, and there are troops, and they are heading for the center. I said, right, out we go. There were no smartphones then, and no available satellite links to get live pictures out. All I could do was report on a landline phone.
Thousands of Chinese troops have opened fire on demonstrators who've been occupying the centre of Peking for weeks. Kate Adie reports from the bloody streets of Peking.
Fires are burning in many of the roads. Army trucks set alight. And there is gunfire from over a wide area. In the main road...
Ultimately, the crucial evidence of what happened was our video footage, first broadcast the following day.
Kate Adie witnessed the worst of the clashes and starts this report as the confrontation unfolded.
The noise of gunfire rose from all over the center of Peking. It was unremitting. Furious people stared in disbelief at the glow in the sky, listening to the sound of shots. Hundreds of people cheered as buses were set alight and army trucks caught fire too. And then, as troop lorries were seen moving down the road, there was gunfire from those lorries.
I could see soldiers on the lorries firing. I turned round and the man on my right wasn't there. He was on the ground. He was dead. I turned to my left and the other man had a massive, great hole in him. I turned to the cameraman and said, we've probably gone past the point where it's too dangerous to stay. And he said, yeah, but we're staying, aren't we? I said, yes.
We picked up a woman with a bullet in the head and took her into a scene of near mayhem. Casualties were arriving every few seconds. On bikes, rickshaws, park benches, carried in, all with gunshot wounds.
We turned up at what turned out to be the children's hospital. And I got out to a scene out of a bad movie. A floor running with blood. A whole place.
In 20 minutes, 40 seriously injured were brought for emergency surgery. 2 were already dead. The operating theatre was overflowing, many of the staff in tears.
If someone died, they just slung the body on the floor and got someone else onto the table.
The troops have been firing indiscriminately, but still, there are thousands of people on the streets who will not move back.
I remember clearly feeling that we had to bear witness to all this.
I'd been conscious we'd seen no other Western TV crews. I knew that the Chinese would deny what was happening. And that's why we stayed out.
Young people were singing the Internationale to a background of gunfire.
After hours of shooting and facing a line of troops, the crowd is still here. They're shouting, "Stop the killing and down with the government."
A huge volley of shots just as I left the front line caused panic. 2 others were killed yards away. 2 more people lay wounded on the ground near me. In the streets, many came up to us, shaking with anger and disbelief and fear. "Tell the world," they said to us.
Tell the world. Tell the world. And I wanted to, and I knew I had to. I felt driven more than any other occasion to want to tell people exactly what happened.
Kate Adie, BBC News, Peking.
We had the footage, but the danger wasn't over. As we took cover in a ditch, I agreed with my cameraman that I'd get the precious tape back to our base. I said, this is it, because it's just got so desperate now. It wasn't just dangerous, it was desperate. So I grabbed the cassette and said, I'm heading back to where we call the office in the nearby hotel. And I started running hard. And there was another volley of shots. And a man cannoned into me from here. And I had the cassette, and I fell straight over him because he went down. And when I got up, I had blood all over there, and I realized that he was shot, and the bullet had gone past there on me. There was a scrape of skin open. And as I lay on the ground, there were others on the ground round me, and they'd been hit. And I saw something weird. Little red sparks, not far from me. Little sort of like red ticks, instantaneously. That was bullets hitting the tarmac. I got up, I just ran, and I ran and I ran and I ran. I absolutely tore through these crowds, being bashed by people, bumping into, avoiding people, and going over dead people. And I finally made it to the big high wall of the hotel and found the gates, huge great gates, locked. So I went up the wall like a lizard. I just went straight up it. And it took all the skin off here, etc. Heaved myself over it and dropped the other side. I was possessed of a sense of determination. And I ran across in front of the hotel, up the steps, and I could see there were figures there. And they were either police or soldiers. And all I remembered doing was I attacked all 3 of them. I kicked one, I whacked another with my elbow and my arm, and I then finally hit one with the cassette. I was absolutely out of my wits. Thank God there was a door open down the corridor. This apparition turned up, covered in blood, grit from the ground, filthy, and not very coherent initially. I'd reached the safety of our BBC base. But we still had to get the pictures, the evidence of the massacre out of the country.
An entire government, I felt, and I'm right, was going to deny it. And we'd seen it in all its terribleness. A country sending in its soldiers to kill its own people.
in the middle of the capital, indiscriminately. We made 5 copies of the precious tape and arranged to smuggle it out of the country. We gave 5 people cassettes, and they were told to go to the airport and get the first plane anywhere. Chinese security were all over like a rash. Somebody headed for Kuala Lumpur, somebody headed for Singapore, and somebody went to Tokyo. That's the cassette that got out. It was hard then, and remains so today, to comprehend the enormity of what had happened. How could soldiers of a disciplined army slaughter hundreds of their own unarmed fellow citizens? Why did the protesters remain in the face of such savagery? How could they just stand there? Why were people cycling along, people going to see? It was a complete and utter incomprehension that their own army could be killing them. Every school child is taught, the army loves the people. They chant it. The army loves the people. They could not get their heads round the fact that the army was shooting at them.
What struck a lot of us was the extraordinarily savage decision to allow an army to come in firing.
Well, that was not something that really was so inconceivable. There were incidents, particularly during the Cultural Revolution, when the army used excessive force to suppress demonstrators. And considering also that China is a country with huge number of dialects, even if the local garrisons in Beijing could not shoot on Beijing citizens, the party could easily have replaced them by sending in units from faraway parts who would not speak Mandarin and would therefore simply follow orders.
The orders must have included shooting those who continued to protest. Because as daylight came to Peking on the 4th of June, the killing resumed.
During the day, soldiers guarding the entrance to Tiananmen Square fired several times into the crowd. Kate Adie sent us this further report on the day's fighting.
The daylight hours have seen more violence. For at 10:23 this morning, there was a sudden and deadly volley from the troops. The crowd ran, and bodies were left lying in the road. The injured were raced away on any available transport. The burnt-out vehicles and signs of battle were not confined to this area. Crossroads around this vast city have wrecked vehicles, broken glass, pools of blood. Half an hour later, again with no reason or warning, the troops opened fire again. Between 30 and 40 people were killed by the 2 volleys. Kate Adie, BBC News, Peking.
The army was told to take it as an attempted revolution. So to the army it was logical. They shot people. Next day, we witnessed an act of defiance which came to symbolize the whole uprising.
As Kate Adie reports from Peking, there are still students prepared to defy the authorities and continue their protests, whatever the risks.
Just after midday, the tanks rolled out of the square. A lone young man stood in front of the first one. The tank faltered, came to a stop. Onto the tank, trying to talk to the men inside. He blocked their way again. The tanks must have avoided him in the next few moments as they moved towards the crossroads. Kate Adie, BBC News, Peking.
No one seems sure what became of the tank man, as he came to be known. Some rumors said he'd been imprisoned or even executed.
But his bravery and vulnerability seemed to me a perfect symbol of the unarmed victims of the massacre. Within days, the Peking Spring withered. The authorities were rounding up large numbers of people. Then they turned their attention to the reporters. The whole of the foreign press was being harassed. We were being threatened. One of my colleagues had a gun held to his head. But we felt it was important to know, was this just in the capital, or was the entire country in turmoil? The decision was taken. We should try and find out what one big city outside, a long way from Beijing, might know. What were things like?
The crackdown by the police and military has spread from Peking to other major cities such as Xi'an, and it's from there that our correspondent Kate Adie sent this report.
Over 500 miles from Peking, at the heart of one of China's 6 ancient cities, the remnants of student posters cling to the walls of the Great Mosque of Xi'an.
Here in Xi'an, life is certainly not back to normal. 3 million people in this city have seen their own students demonstrating. And a great many people are too frightened to tell us what they know of events in Peking and to describe the situation here.
There are photographs of the demonstrations, and we were told of videotapes circulating, brought from Hong Kong, of the massacre in Peking. The young especially would like to speak but dare not. It is unwise for them to be identified in any way. Kate Adie, BBC News, Xi'an.
Historians put the death toll in Beijing at least 2,000. But in China as a whole, who knows how many were killed?
What happened in Beijing was mirrored in other parts of China where army units were also being sent in. They were simply not captured on camera, so we don't know how many actually were killed outside of Beijing. But the general pattern would be similar.
Did it continue for much longer, hunting down people?
After the actual crackdown, then there was a period of rounding up. People who were involved in the demonstrations, they would have to confess and repent and swear their loyalty to the party. And what you also had was that a good number of the student leaders tried to leave China for overseas.
They're shouting, "Stop the killing and down with the government."
All reporters move on to the next big news story. But Tiananmen Square followed me to London. 2 months after the massacre, small acts of courage were still emerging. One of the student leaders, then on the run, managed to smuggle a remarkable sound tape out of the country.
Ling became one of the movement's leaders. A student at university in Beijing, 23 years old. I saw her in Tiananmen Square on the Saturday night, when the army would have been a few miles away on the city's outskirts.
有人说同学死了200多，也有人讲整个广场已经死了4000多。具体的数字到现在我们也不知道，他们通通都死了。越是法西斯丧心病狂的镇压的时候，那么一个真正的人民的民主的共和国，打倒军人统治，人民必胜，共和国万岁！
In the autumn of 1989, the world's attention shifted to the momentous events in Eastern Europe. The Berlin Wall came down. One communist state after another tumbled, followed by the dissolution of the Soviet Union itself in 1991. In this period of revolution, China was the first country where communism was challenged. So why did it survive there?
What is quite ironic about Tiananmen was the timing of it. It happened in China before communism collapsed in the Soviet Union. If the Berlin Wall had came down before Tiananmen Square, the students and other demonstrators in Beijing would have been much more emboldened.
But the students were cautious and realists, wary, as the professor has said, of a ruthless leadership.
If you all come out to demonstrate against the Communist Party, maybe you will get what happened in the Soviet Union. But will you be the first 100,000 who will be martyred? Or perhaps it may not even be 100,000, maybe it's 1 million. And of course the answer was, I'll perhaps wait for somebody else to take the lead.
In the aftermath of Tiananmen Square, the government pressed ahead with economic reforms, leading to a form of free market economy, but made it clear it would not tolerate dissent.
When there's so much money to be made, better things to be had, a different life to be lived to your parents and grandparents who may have starved, you wonder what headway campaigning for ordinary citizens' rights makes, when life in so many material ways is getting better.
The BBC archive makes the point beautifully. In 1995, Carrie Gracie, later the BBC's China editor, looked at what these reforms meant for a one-time radical, now a Beijing taxi driver.
Zhang was 23 when he took part in the democracy demonstrations in Tiananmen Square. But like so many who saw the massacre, he now steers well clear of politics.
天塌下，它有地界的，这是事实。因为老百姓，你应该，你甭考虑这其他的问题，你就考虑你自己的问题，这是最实在的。至于你生活在，就说你生活在一天，那就是你生活的一天，实实在在的一天，考虑那么多没有用。
Anyone with 80 pence for the fare can leave their bicycle at home. This is China's new enterprise economy at work.
想干什么就可以那个，比如说干点，比如想出去玩就可以出去玩去。你像现在似的，过去呢，你像出门就说就打的，就是好像根本连想都不敢想。
There's really a gap between the poor people and the rich people, and people who are, the newly rich, who are getting richer every day.
I think maybe at the present, people just think to work for themselves.
Zhang works 7 nights on top of 7 days. But right now he wants to show me something. It's his ultimate dream. A Rolls Royce.
说至于以后的基业可以，我想应该买一辆宝马。至于这个劳斯莱斯，还是留给我的儿子去完成。
So we set off into the night again to look for the passengers whose 80 pence fares will help turn Zhang's ambition into reality.
Another 10 years on, by 2005, China was in the midst of remarkable economic growth, a true tiger economy.
Shanghai is home to many of China's new millionaires.
Developer Liu Caishun shows me his new fantasy land for those with a couple of million to spare. Wow, look at this. Well, I certainly never expected to see this in a communist country. A marble bathroom and a bath with its own DVD player built in. I've never seen one of those before. I put it to Mr. Liu that most people in Britain would be amazed to find out that such houses exist in China. Even we've been surprised, he tells me. We didn't believe China could change so fast. Shanghai seems to change every week. People are making money and they want to enjoy it. Liu Jixia sells pancakes here from her little stall on a street corner. But for years she worked in a textile plant, 15 hours a day, with only 1 day off a month. Finally, she tells me she'd had enough. I asked the boss for 1 day off to see my son, she says. I hadn't seen him for a year, but he refused. That was it. I thought even collecting rubbish is better than working in this factory. The workers in this slum are all from China's countryside. Still, millions of migrants flood into China's cities.
China today is a country of huge contradictions, a country where private individuals are free to accrue massive personal wealth, but where individual rights are still barely understood, and where the Communist Party still remains in absolute control of political power.
In a nearby village, I meet a democracy activist. Yao Lifa was once an elected official. He's seen for himself how the system works. More than 90% of elections in China are a sham, he says. How can elections be free? This is a one-party state.
Almost 30 years after the uprising, China is now the second biggest economy in the world. Its major cities rival London and New York. But still, the truth of the massacre is apparently too potent, too dangerous to admit. The spirit of Tiananmen Square may not be dead.
Against the huge economic blossoming, where people have luxury bathrooms, there are mansions being built, there are fantastic cities, they're forging ahead in every way. It's an amazing leap forward, to use their own phrase. But I do reflect that human nature wants freedom. It wants a voice. It has opinions. In the end, it can't be bullied forever.
I'm currently banned from entering China. The present leadership is particularly sensitive, with a long memory and a fear of the truth.
The Chinese government has a history of denying facts, scrubbing out matters which they find embarrassing, unacceptable. Here we are, decades later, they're still denying it.
But there is a perception that not all China's billion-plus citizens are without skepticism.
People in China do know that the Communist Party of China has a monopoly of the truth and a monopoly of history. And therefore, they may not know what the truth was, but they know what they were being told is not the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
I did return for the 20th anniversary of the massacre and experienced the apparatus of state control in full working order. People tell us remembering is dangerous. These events remain taboo here, airbrushed from the history books and blocked on the internet. The Beijing Hotel was our base back then. The balcony our ringside seat to the killings on June the 3rd and 4th. Memories come flooding back. I wanted to know what happened to those who opposed sending in the army. Committee member Bao Tong was one, and he resigned from the party in protest. He was immediately arrested and accused of spreading counter-revolutionary propaganda. Bao Tong served 4 years in prison and has spent long periods under house arrest over the last 18 years.
The state apparatus was still trying to keep the little hot flame of Tiananmen away from people. Students we met looked slyly at us when you talked about the internet. They used other sources. Clever, smart students knew how to get around the great firewall, which prevents ordinary Chinese reading a word on the internet, anything about Tiananmen Square in '89.
The party resorts to intimidation to assert its power, as it always has. In the spring of 1989, construction worker Ji Jir-yong had to cross the square every evening to get home.
The tanks just drove straight into the crowd. Blood burst out. Imagine people's heads under the tanks, completely smashed. They were shooting while running. I fell to the ground. The people around me used their shirts to stop the bleeding and carried me to the hospital. The Communist Party have always said they respect human rights, but they won't admit that they shot me and prevent me from telling the truth about June the 4th.
What we want is more freedom. We still have a same party who is trying to hide or blur every facts. This is a big crime to humanity, and they want it to be continued for another 100 years. But is that possible? Do they understand what kind of world they are in now? I don't think so.
Ai Weiwei is one man who's prepared to challenge the all-powerful Communist Party relentlessly. But does the party take any notice of what anyone else thinks?
When Deng Xiaoping decided to use force, whatever damage this might do to China's international image, it would blow over. And they were right. The damage to China's image overseas did not last all that long. Let's also not forget that when Xi Jinping became leader in 2012, one of the very first things he said was that the Chinese Communist Party will not make the mistake that the Soviet Union made when a traitor like Gorbachev should emerge within the party, that basically, if such a figure should emerge in China, he will be squashed.
In China, memories fade. The young learn nothing of what happened.
2 were already dead.
We saw what they did to their own people. I feel so strongly that they're trying to erase it. Deng Xiaoping said, "The West will forget." Well, I hope we won't.
Making this program, I've looked hard at my own first draft of history. Though delivered in the heat of the moment, I feel it stands the test of time.
When they say, "Oh, Tiananmen Square, were you there?" You say, "Yes, we were there and we got the pictures. We got evidence. We got a slice of history."
It matters if you've been an eyewitness. I reported what I saw in Tiananmen Square. I was there.